Mr. Majewski's Anatomy 32 class, lecture, chapter 3, part 2, epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue, the first thing you'll notice is that it is densely packed continuous sheets of cells in one or more layers. The functions of epithelial tissue include acting as a selective barrier, either to aid or limit the transfer of substances. It can release products through its free surface, or to act as protection against friction, since friction is the enemy of our body. So if you look at a sort of generic example of epithelial tissue, there are a few things you will notice. First of all epithelial tissue lies on top of what's called the basement membrane. The basement membrane is an extracellular layer composed primarily of proteins and protein fibers. Now, the side of the cell which is closest to the basement membrane is referred to as the basal surface. The lateral surfaces are the sides of the cell that touch the other cells, and then the apical surface is the side of the cell furthest away from the basement membrane, and eventually it forms the free surface that is next to the open space or lumen of whatever structure it is a part of. You also notice that epithelial tissue is avascular, so there are not blood vessels flowing through it. Instead, it depends on the adjacent tissue, usually connective tissue, to have blood vessels that are brought close to the epithelial tissue to allow for the diffusion of nutrients to the epithelial tissue and the eventual diffusion of waste from the epithelial tissue back to the bloodstream. Epithelial tissue is classified by two primary characteristics: the number of cell layers and the shape of the cells closest to the lumen or free surface. So for instance, if you look at the arrangement of layers, you see three classifications. Simple, which would be where there's only a single sheet of cells. Pseudostratified, where there's only a single sheet of cells, but looking at it, you could get confused into thinking that there were more than one layer. And stratified, where there are multiple layers of cells. If you look at the characteristic cell shape, it can be classified as squamous, which means flat cells, cuboidal, which is cells that are shaped kind of like cubes, and columnar, which are cells shaped kind of like columns. So as we go through the specific examples, we're going to start with simple squamous epithelial. Simple one-layer squamous flat epithelium. So the cross-section you see here is of the peritoneum, and the simple squamous epithelium is that thin layer on the top. The rest of it is connective tissue and muscle tissue lying underneath it. So places you can find simple squamous epithelium include the lining of the heart, the lining of blood vessels, and the lining of lymphatic vessels. And obviously you can also find it in serous membranes, including the peritoneum. It's also worth noting here that pretty much the key word you're looking for is thelium, because there's also endothelium and mesothelium, which basically look and function just like epithelium. They just have a different origin from the embryo. And the functions include things like filtration, diffusion, and secretion. Simple cuboidal epithelium. As you see here, it often ends up in a ring shape. So what you should see here is one layer of cuboidal cells all the way around. Sometimes you might see two cells on top of each other in one or two places in the ring. That's okay, that's just mitosis going on. It is found in many locations, including the surface of the ovary, the lining of certain parts of the kidney tubules, and ducts of many glands, and also the secretory portion of some glands, for example the thyroid. So it's very often important in secretion and absorption. Nonciliated simple columnar epithelium. So if you have columnar epithelium and it's only one layer, it's simple columnar epithelium, and you'll see that the nucleuses tend to line up with each other. Now this example lacks cilia. However, it does contain what are called microvilli, which are protrusions of the cell membrane to facilitate absorption, which is often found in the small intestine. So places for this type of tissue is it lines the gastrointestinal tracts. It's found in many glands and also in the gallbladder. And its functions can be secretion and also absorption. So for instance, over here you see this cell with a really large clump of stuff in it. That's actually mucus that it's going to secrete into the gastrointestinal tract, again to reduce friction. Ciliated simple columnar epithelium. In this case, you'll find at the apical surface long structures that we know as cilia, which wave to cause a flow or a current, depending on where it's located. And here, in this case, we're looking at the uterine tube, so it'll cause a current that'll carry the ovary to the uterus. Not the ovary, I'm sorry, that'll carry the oocyte to the uterus. Locations, it lines the respiratory system, including some bronchioles. It is found in uterine tubes, in the uterus, in the paranasal sinuses, and also in the canal of the spinal cord and the ventricles of the brain. And basically the cilia cause a beating that allows the movement of materials in a specific direction. And sometimes you also can get secretion by these cells. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium. In this case, we're looking at an example that has cilia. So as you can see, some of the cells look very columnar-like, and others start off at the basement membrane, but don't make it all the way to the top surface. This makes it look like there are multiple layers, but in actuality, there is only one layer, as you can judge by the columnar-shaped cells that go from the basement membrane all the way up to the apical surface. So the ciliated version is found in the upper respiratory tract. The non-ciliated version is found in larger ducts of some glands in the epididymis and part of the male urethra. The ciliated functions mainly to produce mucus that it then will trap and then cause the mucus to flow out of the respiratory tract. The non-ciliated version tends to function in absorption and protection. Now we move on to the stratified or multi-layer epithelial tissues. The first we'll look at is the stratified squamous or flat epithelial tissue. You'll notice that some of the cells, as you look at them down in the lower levels, closer to the basement membrane, look more columnar, cuboidal-ish. They're not quite that flat. But as you get closer and closer to the apical surface, you see that they flatten out. So look at the top layers to identify the shape of these tissues. Now you can have keratinized and non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The non-keratinized, as seen in the picture, the lower picture, is found in moist places in the body that could experience a lot of friction, such as the lining of the mouth, the esophagus, the epiglottis and pharynx, as well as the vagina. And it's expected that these cells on the apical surface will end up being sloughed off. With keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, it is found at our skin layer, and specifically it is the surface of the skin that is keratinized. Basically, these cells have died and ruptured, and all that's left is the tough keratinized proteins. So if you think about it, when you touch someone's hand, you're actually touching a dead part of them. And these stratified squamous epithelium function to protect against abrasion, against water loss, against UV damage, and against microbes. Next is stratified cuboidal epithelium. Here you can see that familiar ring shape, and it's very clear that throughout the entire structure you have two or more layers of cells. This is found in the ducts of sweat glands, in the esophageal glands, and in the male urethra. And its functions include protection, limited secretion, and some absorption. Next is stratified columnar epithelium. You will see multiple layers of columnar-like cells. The uppermost layer will have the nucleuses lined up. The lower layers will not have that necessarily. And it is found in places such as the urethra of both male and females, in the large excretory ducts of some glands, in the anal mucous membrane and in the conjunctiva of the eye. And its main functions are protection and secretion. A lot of the epithelial tissues that are engaged in secretion are often engaged in the secretion of mucus. And then finally, we have the transitional epithelium. It too is stratified, but since there's only a limited number of examples of transitional epithelium, it doesn't have to be called stratified transitional epithelium. In this case, if you look at the cells near the surface, you see that they tend to be in a more rounded shape. Kind of cuboidal, but not quite. And the reason for this is that they are found primarily in the urinary system. So for instance, in the urinary bladder, when the bladder is relatively empty, these cells and these tissues are in a relaxed state, and so they are rounded. But when the bladder fills up, the tissue will get stretched, and these cells will start to look more flat in nature. So again, it's found in the urinary bladder, the ureters, and the urethra, and it functions to allow the urinary organs to stretch without rupturing, and also therefore to provide some protection. So, epithelial tissue. Key things to look for. You need to find that free surface. The only way you know it's epithelial tissue for sure is if it's lining a free surface. You then look at the shape of the cells and how many layers of cells there are. And then finally look for any additional apical structures such as cilia. So, epithelium is also found in glands, and it is in the glands that they function in more alternative forms of secretions beyond mucus production. So a gland can be a single cell or a group of cells that secrete substances into ducts, onto a surface, or into the blood. So there are endocrine glands. These produce secretions that will enter the interstitial fluid, the fluid surrounding them, and then diffuse into the bloodstream. The most common example of this is hormones. And then you have the exocrine glands. They secrete substances into ducts that then empty onto a surface. So, for example, your sweat glands are an example of exocrine glands. They can come in a variety of shapes, including tubular and acinar, tubular being long and straight, acinar being long but rounded at the end, and these can be simply just one big tube. They can be simple branched tubular structures or even coiled. You can also find them as compound glands. In this case, there are multiple structures that are then feeding into one duct to then allow the release of the secretion. Finally, the glands can also be distinguished by how they release their secretion. There is merocrine secretion, which is basically secretory vesicles fusing with the apical surface's plasma membrane and releasing the secretion into the lumen. So in this case, basically it's exocytosis, and a common example is in the salivary glands. Second is apocrine secretion. Here, the secretion accumulates on the apical portion or layer of the cell and then is pinched off to be finally secreted. An example of this is the mammary gland. And then finally, you can have holocrine secretion, which is that the surface cells will fill up with the secretion and eventually rupture and die. And so the complete secretion includes lots of cell components like DNA. An example of this is the sebaceous gland or oil glands of our skin. So that is the epithelial tissues. I hope that was of help.